Into this setting, Muhammad ibn Abdullah was born in Mecca in 570 AD, born into the respected Hashim clan of the Quraysh. Muhammad became an orphan by the time he was 6, and was raised by his uncle Abu Talib after the death of his grandfather when he was 8. This uncle, Abu Talib, was the head of the Hashim clan and a trader who went to Syria on business trips. By the age of 12, Muhammad had already started going with his uncle to Syria on such trips, and he learned how to be a caravan trader. As an orphan, Muhammad had no legal rights of inheritance, and so he was considered to be a poor man. As he grew older, he became responsible for taking goods by caravan to Syria. When he was 25 years old, Muhammad was in charge of the merchandise of a wealthy 40-year-old widow named Khadija. It is said that he so impressed her by the way he carried out his duties that she asked him to marry her, and he agreed. They married, and Khadija bore Muhammad 2 sons who died young, and 4 daughters, the best known being Fatima. This marriage was a turning point in Muhammad's life, making him wealthy enough to do as he pleased. Being of a reflective nature, Muhammad began spending nights sometimes in the caves in the hills a few miles outside Mecca to engage in solitary spiritual search. This was not an uncommon practice among certain religious-minded Arabs then. In the year 610 AD, when Muhammad was 40 years old, he was alone in a cave one night when he saw a large being appear before him, who pressed against him forcefully, saying, "Recite," or repeat. Muhammad fearfully replied, "I am unlearned." The being pressed him again and said the same words, and Muhammad also replied as before. Again the being pressed him for the 3rd time, saying, "Recite." Muhammad finally understood he was being told to repeat whatever the being was going to tell him. The being then said, "Recite, in the name of the Lord who created man from a clot of blood. Recite, your Lord is most generous. He teaches by the pen, teaches man what he knew not." At first Muhammad was deeply troubled by the vision. There were certain people known as soothsayers who would go into demon-possessed trances, and he was afraid he was becoming one of them. He even thought of committing suicide, but his wife encouraged and comforted him. She took him to a cousin of hers named Waraka, a Christian by religion, who told Muhammad that this being he had seen was actually the angel Gabriel, and Waraka also gave him encouragement. Muhammad eventually came to believe that the message given to him, and those that followed after, were identical with those sent by God through other prophets before to the Jews and Christians. From this time on, at varying intervals until his death 22 years later, Muhammad continued receiving revelations, verbal messages that he believed came directly from God, sometimes accompanied with visions of the being he identified as Gabriel, although more often they would later come as just a voice he heard in his heart. When these messages came, sometimes he would hear a noise like a bell, and his face would change color, and he would also break out into heavy sweating, even in the cold of winter. Muhammad believed the messages he was receiving were the direct words of God and that he was only reciting them. Sometimes these messages were kept in memory by Muhammad and his followers, and sometimes they were written down. It seems that only after the death of Muhammad did the Quran begin to be written down as a whole. The earliest messages revealed to Muhammad emphasized the goodness and power of God as seen in nature and in the prosperity of the Meccans, and the messages called on the Meccans to be grateful and to worship the Lord of the Kaaba, who was identified with Allah. Gratitude towards God was to be expressed in generosity with one's wealth. Men were warned that they will be resurrected and appear before God on the last day to be judged according to their deeds, and will then go to either heaven or hell. Muhammad said he wasn't telling his hearers anything new, but was the original religion which they had left to follow their own traditions. The first 3 years, Muhammad shared his experiences only with friends, and soon he had gathered some who accepted his claim to be a prophet and who joined him in common worship and prayers, which involved bending and bowing before God in prostration. About the year 613 AD, Muhammad began preaching publicly, and he and his followers spent their days together in the house of a young convert named Al-Arqam, where Muhammad taught them. They probably also worshipped together in the Kaaba. By proclaiming his message publicly, Muhammad began gaining more followers. Muhammad's preaching clearly criticized the conduct and attitudes of the rich merchants of Mecca. Attempts were made at first to get him to soften his criticism by offering him a greater share in trade and a marriage alliance with one of the wealthiest families, but he refused these offers. About 615 AD, more active opposition appeared. Points in his message were questioned, such as that men would be resurrected before the judgment. Commercial pressure was also brought to bear on Muhammad's supporters, and there was a mild persecution of Muhammad and those who followed him. In one incident, as Muhammad was prostrating himself in prayer, someone threw a fetus of a camel on his back. He kept on praying, but afterwards stood up and cursed the man who did it. Muhammad didn't seem to believe very much in forgiving his enemies. After opposition started, the Quranic messages of warnings of the judgment to come became more frequent. Stories of previous messengers or prophets were recounted in order to convince the hearers of the certainty of the punishment to come. Perhaps because the opposition to Muhammad also included a call to return to the traditional religion of Mecca and its idol worship, the messages Muhammad received now began to include an increasingly strong attack on idols and an insistence on belief in Allah alone. Muhammad's life was protected by his clan, even though many of them also disliked his preaching, because they were honor-bound to protect him as a member. Although there was no central government, the Bedouin rules governing blood feuds and the fear of retaliation helped to keep society in check. Under those rules, only the head of his own clan could punish him, and Muhammad's guardian, his uncle Abu Talib, was the head of the clan. A leader of the opposition arose named Abu Jahl, who felt Muhammad was just trying to build himself a position of political authority. About 616 AD, Abu Jahl organized a boycott of the clan of Hashim by the other clans in Mecca because the Hashims continued to protect Muhammad and wouldn't stop his preaching. After 3 years, though, the boycott eventually lost its force and was dropped. Shortly after this, in the period of 619 to 620, Muhammad's wife Khadijah and his uncle Abu Talib both died. Another uncle, Abu Lahab, became the head of the Hashim clan. He was closer to the richest merchants, and at their instigation he removed the clan's protection from Muhammad. This meant that Muhammad could easily be attacked, and he could no longer safely preach his religion in Mecca. Muhammad left for a neighboring town, but he was also rejected there. He then made arrangements with another clan in Mecca for temporary protection and returned to Mecca. About 250 miles north of Mecca was a town called Yathrib. Yathrib was an oasis founded by Jews who had settled there and cultivated it. 3 large Jewish tribes living there had the best lands, but 8 other Arab tribes had emigrated there and were now in a more politically dominant position. The 2 largest Arab tribes had had serious fights among themselves since 618, and a number of both tribes had been killed in blood feuds. Typically, a blood feud would go on and on for generations, unless an outside arbiter could be found and agreed upon by both parties to settle their differences and arrange compensation between them. The 2 tribes were looking for such an arbiter when some of them came to Mecca in 620 AD for the annual pilgrimage and heard Muhammad. The next year, in 621 AD, a small group from Yathrib at the pilgrimage decided to become followers of Muhammad and to make propaganda for him when they returned home. The next year, 75 more pilgrims from Yathrib came and made a further pledge to Muhammad. Muhammad was invited to come to Yathrib to rule as an arbitrator between the 2 warring tribes. Part of their acceptance of Muhammad and his message was no doubt due to the influence of the Jews at Yathrib, with their faith in one God only and their hope of a messianic ruler to come. Muhammad, facing increasing opposition in Mecca, agreed to come to Yathrib with his followers, and he began encouraging his followers to start making their way to Yathrib. The Quraysh of Mecca soon became aware something was going on, and they began to worry that if Muhammad left, he could possibly become a greater threat to them later on. They sought to catch him before he could leave, but Muhammad managed to escape together with Abu Bakr, one of his closest followers and lieutenants. Taking unused paths and hiding in caves along the way, they made their way safely to Yathrib. The date of their exodus, July 16, 622 AD, has become known as the Hijra, and is now the starting date for the Muslim calendar. Muhammad changed the name of Yathrib to Medina, which in Arabic means the city. When he was getting ready to flee to Medina, Muhammad had a dream or vision of himself going one night from Mecca to Jerusalem, called the Night of Ascent. Widely held tradition among Muslims says that he rode on the back of a magical horse with the face of an angel, and when he arrived at the temple in Jerusalem, he ascended from there, passing through the 7 heavens until he came within 2 bow lengths of God. Before his journey, Muhammad's chest was said to have been opened up by the angel Gabriel, and his heart had been purified of all unbelief and sin. As he passed through the 7 heavens, Muhammad met different prophets like Adam, Abraham, Jesus, and Moses, who all confirmed Muhammad as the greatest of the prophets. When he was in the presence of God, Muhammad was told to order the believers to pray 50 times a day. On his way back down, Moses met Muhammad and urged him to go back up and seek a lesser amount. Muhammad went back and was granted only 40 times a day. On the way back down again, Moses urged him to seek a further reduction. This went on again and again until finally Muhammad was granted 5 daily prayers for the believers. When Moses urged him again to ask for another reduction, Muhammad told Moses that he was embarrassed to keep on going up and asking. In this way, supposedly, the 5 daily prayers became an established custom for Muslims. After arriving in Medina with his followers, the first 18 months were spent by the Muslims in settling down. Muhammad was given a piece of land, and he had a house built which eventually held apartments grouped around a central courtyard for each of his later wives. During this period, Muhammad sought to win the support of the Jews. Muhammad had a revelation saying there is no compulsion in religion. In other words, faith can't be forced on anyone. This was abrogated or cancelled out, however, by later revelations. The idea of abrogation is an important one in Islam. This doctrine says that whenever Allah changes his mind and gives a verse or command contrary to something he has said before, then what was said before is cancelled out. In this way, for example, Muslims in an early Quranic verse were permitted to drink wine, but when a later verse came which forbid it, the earlier verse was no longer valid, even though it was still kept in the Quran. Finally, after 18 months, Muhammad's attitude towards the Jews began to change, and there occurred what has been called the break with the Jews. He had hoped the Jews would accept him as a prophet, and he claimed that their own scriptures foretold his coming. But the Jews rejected this, mainly because he was not Jewish, also because he clearly didn't know the Jewish scriptures. Now Muhammad began charging the Jews with hiding references to him in the Old Testament, and he stopped trying to make concessions to them to gain their acceptance. Up until then, for example, the Muslims had been told to pray facing Jerusalem like the Jews did, and the Muslims also fasted during the Jewish days of repentance before the Day of Atonement. But now Muhammad had new revelations, changing the direction of prayer towards the Kaaba in Mecca. He also instituted Ramadan, the religious month of fasting for Muslims, to take the place of the fast around the Day of Atonement. He also instituted the Eid or feast holiday commemorating Abraham's supposed sacrifice of Ishmael. These kind of changes helped many Arabs to be more positively disposed to Islam. Muhammad claimed he was really preaching the pure and original religion which the Jews and Christians had corrupted. In Medina, the concept of Ummah, or community or brotherhood of Muslim believers, became clearer. Before then, Muslims had just been general monotheists, but now they became a separate community different from Jews and Christians. The identity developed more sharply of a special community that was submitted to Allah and His Prophet Muhammad. The strong Arabic character of Islam was established. The immigrants from Mecca to Medina had been guests of their brother Muslims in Medina. By the second year of their stay in Medina, the Muslim community's finances were running low. Up until that point, Muhammad had tried through peaceful means to appeal to the Meccans, but without any success. Muhammad then had a new revelation that commanded the Muslims to attack and raid the caravans going to and from Mecca, with the justification being that they were pagans. This also happened to be a very typical way for Arab Bedouins to gain wealth and riches whenever in financial difficulty. Muhammad himself led 3 of these raids in 623. They all failed, probably because traitors betrayed the Muslim movements to the enemy. At last, in January of 624 AD, a small band of Muslims successfully attacked a caravan coming up from Yemen during the holy months, when Meccan treaties guaranteed there would be no attacks upon pilgrims. In doing this, the Muslims had shockingly violated the cultural ideas of sanctity. Even worse was the way in which it was done. The Muslims had shaved their heads and pretended to be pilgrims, and then treacherously attacked the lightly armed pilgrims. Muhammad at first was embarrassed, but then he received a revelation justifying the attack, saying that although it was wrong for the Muslims to have broken the sanctity of the holy months, a far greater wrong had been done to them by the Meccans' refusal to allow the Muslims to go on pilgrimage to Mecca. In March of 624, Muhammad led a raid on a caravan coming from Syria to Mecca. A battle was fought at a place called Badr between the Muslims and the caravan's supporting force of 800 men who came up from Mecca. Although the Muslims numbered only 350 men, they had laid a trap for the Meccan army and held the superior ground. In the battle that followed, the Muslims decisively defeated the Meccans, killing many of their prominent men while losing only a few of their own. The Muslims claimed this victory as a great vindication of their cause and as proof that Allah was with them. The captured booty was divided among the warriors, with Muhammad keeping 1/5. This victory greatly strengthened Muhammad's position and encouraged others to convert to Islam. The remaining waverers among the Arabs of Medina probably became Muslims about this time. Muhammad was beginning to see that the sword brought more converts than the tongue. The Jews of Medina were not very happy about the Muslim victory. Some Jews wrote rhymes against Muhammad. With Muhammad's connivance, his followers murdered different individuals, one being a woman, and Muhammad said nothing against it. In fact, Muhammad encouraged his followers to enact revenge on anyone who mocked him or opposed him, and he told his followers they could use deceit and lies to do so if necessary. Realizing that the Jews were his enemies, Muhammad now became determined to get rid of them. He accused one Jewish tribe that controlled the market in Medina, the Banu Qaynuqa, of breaking a treaty with him over a minor incident and said they must now accept Islam. They refused, and so Muhammad attacked them, defeating them in 15 days. After they surrendered, he drove them out of their homes and confiscated their property. Muhammad had wanted to kill all the men, but was restrained by a leader of the Khazraj, one of Medina's larger Arab tribes. That year, 624 AD, Muhammad also led Muslim forces on raids against other hostile Arab tribes with some success. Around this time, Muhammad was using marriage relationships to bring greater unity to the Muslim emigrants. After the death of his wife Khadijah in 619, after 25 years of marriage, Muhammad started taking other wives. Muhammad's favorite wife was Aisha, the daughter of his close friend Abu Bakr, who was to become the leader of the Muslims after Muhammad's death. When Muhammad married Aisha, he was 50 years old, while she was only 6. The marriage was consummated 3 years later when she was 9 years old. The Quran told Muslims they could have up to 4 wives, but Muhammad was allowed as many as he wanted. By the end of his life, Muhammad had at least 12 wives, plus 2 concubines, one being Mary, a Coptic Christian slave girl. Several sons were born to his wives, but every male died in infancy. The closest male relative Muhammad had was his nephew Ali, whom he married to his daughter Fatima. Ali later became the 4th leader of Islam. Muhammad also married Hafsa, the daughter of Umar, who would later become Islam's 2nd ruler. Another of Muhammad's daughters, Kulthum, was given to Uthman, who was later to become Islam's 3rd ruler. The earliest Quranic messages which Muhammad had received in Mecca had their emphasis on calling men to moral and religious obedience of Allah. The messages which Muhammad received later while in Medina talked more about the rules for the Muslim community. The messages also consoled the Muslims in their difficulties with the Meccans, and also frequently contained defenses of Muhammad's personal life. Stories were now included in the Quran about biblical figures familiar to the Jews and Christians, but that were often changed from what the Bible told and were remarkably similar to stories and traditions from the Jewish Midrash and the Christian apocryphal writings that were circulating. In March of 625 AD, the Meccans came to attack Muhammad in Medina with 3,000 men. They almost defeated the Muslims in a battle at the nearby hill of Uhud on the outskirts of Medina. Muhammad himself was wounded in the battle, but the Meccans quit the fight and left before gaining a complete victory, and so the Muslims were able to recover. For the Muslims, this defeat was a great shock. If the battle at Badr meant that God was with them, then what did this mean? Muhammad received a new revelation saying the defeat was the fault of the Muslims for not obeying his orders, and that it was a trial meant to test their faith in Allah. For the next 2 years, the Meccans and Muslims prepared to fight each other again. Muhammad fought against other hostile tribes in raids meant to keep them from making treaties with Mecca. He also attacked another Jewish tribe in Medina called Banu Nadir, which had helped some of his enemies. The Jews were defeated in order to leave their homes and possessions, which became booty for Muhammad and the Muslims. Then, 2 years after the Battle of Uhud, in the year 627 AD, the Meccan Quraysh came against Muhammad again with a larger force of 10,000 men. Warned of their coming in advance, the Muslims dug a ditch around vulnerable places in Medina, and the Meccan cavalry could not break through even after 2 weeks of trying. The Meccans finally gave up and returned home, and never again tried to attack Muhammad. After the siege of Medina, Muhammad had a revelation that the Muslims should attack another large Jewish tribe in Medina called the Banu Qurayza. They had not been hostile to the Muslims, but they also had not helped them in their fight when the Meccans had laid siege to Medina. So the Muslims attacked the Banu Qurayza, and they surrendered. All the women and children were taken captive as slaves and concubines, and their property was confiscated. The men, numbering between 600 to 1,000, were brought the next day by groups into the center of town, hands bound behind their backs, where the Muslims, with Muhammad's approval, beheaded them. This incident has been something difficult for later Muslims to justify. After this, Muhammad saw himself in a dream performing the annual pilgrimage to Mecca, and in March of 628 AD, he set out to do so with 1,500 followers, lightly armed and driving sacrificial animals before them. The Meccans were determined not to let the Muslims enter their town, and Muhammad stopped at a place about 10 miles from the territory of Mecca, and the two sides negotiated. After some days, the Meccans finally made a treaty with Muhammad. By agreement, neither side would attack each other for 10 years, and the Muslims would be permitted to make the pilgrimage to Mecca the following year of 629. Muhammad agreed to send back anyone who came to him from Mecca, while the Meccans were not required to reciprocate if any Muslim came to them. The Quran proclaimed the treaty a great victory, although many Muslims at the time were dissatisfied with the treaty conditions. The orderly withdrawal of the Muslims showed the Meccans how completely Muhammad controlled his followers. Partly to reward his followers for their obedience, 2 months later Muhammad led the same force without any provocation against the Jewish fortress of Khaybar north of Medina. After a siege, it finally submitted, and the Jews were allowed to remain on condition of giving up half their annual income from the date harvest to Medina. A captive Jewish woman cooked Muhammad a lamb which was poisoned. Muhammad survived the attempt, but the effect of the poison sickened him and finally led to his death a couple of years later. Throughout the years of 628 and 629, Muhammad's power was growing, and his success led more men to become Muslims, for the religious attraction of Islam was greatly supplemented by the appeal of material gain from the spoils of war. In 629 AD, as was agreed in his treaty with Mecca, Muhammad came with his armies to Mecca to do pilgrimage at the Kaaba. The Meccan forces withdrew to positions outside the town. Muhammad and his followers entered Mecca, and they behaved themselves, thus winning over some of the Quraysh who had been against him. Later in 629 AD, when some allies of Muhammad were attacked by allies of Mecca, Muhammad repudiated the treaty he had made with Mecca, even though the Meccans sought to restore it. Muhammad secretly raised an army of 10,000 men, and in 630 he came with his forces to attack Mecca. When the Meccans saw the campfires of the Muslim army outside the town, they realized it was hopeless to resist, and they formally submitted to Muhammad. Muhammad promised a general amnesty, and when he entered Mecca there was virtually no resistance. After taking Mecca, Muhammad became militarily the strongest man in Arabia. Many tribes had made alliances with him, and as he became more powerful, he made it a condition that they become Muslim. Muhammad also benefited from the final defeat of the Persian Empire by the Roman Byzantines in 628 AD. For in the Yemen and other places along the Persian Gulf, minorities that once relied on Persian support against the Byzantines now turned to Muhammad. At the end of 630 AD, Muhammad led the greatest of his raids with 30,000 men on a month's journey up to the Syrian border. In this campaign he pioneered the invasion of Syria and the future expansion of Islam, although the campaign itself that he led was eventless. In 631 AD, Muhammad had new revelations that abrogated the past revelation about not using force in conversion. Surah 9:5 says, "But when the forbidden months are past, then fight and slay the pagans wherever you find them, and seize them, beleaguer them, and lie in wait for them in every stratagem of war. But if they repent and establish regular prayers and practice regular charity, then open the way for them, for Allah is oft forgiving, most merciful. Also Surah 9:29, Fight those who believe not in Allah nor the last day, nor hold that forbidden which hath been forbidden by Allah and His Apostle, nor acknowledge the religion of truth, even if they are the people of the book, until they pay the jizya tax with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. It became the custom after this that conquered Christians and Jews, or any other people of the book, would have to pay a large annual tax called jizya if they wouldn't convert to Islam. Idol-worshipping pagans, on the other hand, only had the option to convert or be killed. In 632, Muhammad performed the pilgrimage to the Kaaba, and he officially incorporated its rituals into Islam. In a final sermon before his death, Muhammad is said to have ordained the basic rituals which became known as the 5 pillars of Islam, and declared that after him would come no other prophet. He then returned to Medina, and shortly afterwards became sick and died with his head lying on the lap of his favorite wife, Aisha. A mosque was built over the site, and today is a popular site of pilgrimage for Muslims. Before his death, Muhammad had not selected a successor, but when he was sick he chose his friend and follower Abu Bakr to lead the Muslims in prayer in his place. After his death, a small committee chose Abu Bakr to be the new leader of the Muslims. By the time of his death, Muhammad was in control of practically all of Arabia. In less than 30 years after his death, Muslims had defeated the Middle Eastern parts of the Byzantine and former Persian empires and occupied a vast territory from Libya to Persia. Within a century after his death, Muslims had brought a large part of the globe from Spain across Central Asia over to India under a new Arab Muslim empire. There have been differing opinions of Muhammad, even by long-term Christian missionaries to Muslims. Some say that he was demon-possessed. Others say he was a genuine seeker for truth who became misled because he never knew what the gospel really was. Some Christian scholars felt he was a genuine religious reformer who ended up being swayed by the influence of political power. Others looked at his ability to come up with a revelation to justify his own life whenever it was convenient, and consider him just a shrewd manipulator. For example, when Muhammad had 6 wives already, he wanted the beautiful Zainab, who was married to Muhammad's adopted son Zaid. Muhammad already had more than the 4 wives permitted to other Muslims, and in Arab culture to marry an adopted son's wife was considered like incest. But Muhammad had a revelation that Allah wanted Muhammad to have her, and so Zaid dutifully divorced her to let Muhammad take her as his 7th wife. In many ways, the life of Muhammad is a quandary for Christians, both to understand how he could have such an influence over so many lives, and also to understand how we should relate to Muslims. It's difficult for us to see how anyone could think of comparing the life and character of Muhammad to Jesus Christ and end up considering Muhammad to be greater. But it is important for us to know his life in order to understand Muslim mentality. For one thing, we can see that Muhammad never was acquainted with the true gospel of Christ. He never saw true Christianity lived out before him. The central Muslim anti-Christian arguments and doctrines he formulated, based on his understanding of what Christians believed, were sadly very far from the Bible's teachings, and were based on the sorry state of Christianity that existed in Arabia then. The normal Muslim today has for the most part still not had the chance to become acquainted with the gospel. As the Muslim looks at the idolatry and paganism of traditional Christianity in Europe, he feels that he has the truth on his side. An important thing to keep in mind also is that for Muslims, Muhammad is the ideal man, considered to be almost perfect like Christ is for the Christian. Although we may see many things that are reprehensible in the life of Muhammad, it doesn't help us to attack him when talking with a Muslim, any more than we would appreciate hearing someone trying to tell us that Jesus was wicked.